Okay, so no one has shown up for the book club today, but that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and record it because I was going to share some cool books with you. Um, First off, fairy tales. I don't know. I grew up absolutely loving fairy tales. In fact, I was obsessed with fairy tales as a kid. This is one of my fairy tale books from when I was a kid. It's Hans Christian Andersen, Fairy Tales to Read Aloud. Hans Christian Andersen, is most famous for The Little Mermaid, but he wrote many different fairy tales. I'm going to read one to you today called The Wild Swans. Now, something to remember about fairy tales, we're so used to um, Disney fairy tales where everything is sweet and light. There might be some darkness, but everything's happy at the end. Many fairy tales actually involved maybe a little blood and gore because they were supposed to be tales told about things that happened in communities. Most of them were warnings to explain some things that were going on. This one is called The Wild Swans. Far away, where the swallows fly, when winter comes, lived a king who had 11 sons and a daughter. The 11 brothers wrote upon golden slates with diamond pencils and could read just as well without a book as with one. So there was no mistake about there being a real princess. Elise, their sister, sat upon a little glass footstool, and she had a picture book which had cost half a kingdom. These children were very happy, but it was not to last. The king married a wicked queen who was not at all kind to the children. They found that out on the first day. Ooh, the evil stepmother. When the children wanted to play at having company, instead of having as many cakes or apples as they wanted, she would only let them have some sand in a teacup. And she said they must make believe. The next week, she sent little Elise into the country to live with a farmer and his wife, and it did not take her long to make the king believe so many bad things about the boys that he cared no more about them. Fly out into the wicked world and look after yourselves, said the wicked queen. You shall fly about like birds without voices. But she could not make things as bad for them as she would have liked. They turned into 11 beautiful wild swans and flew out of the palace window, right over the park and into the woods. It was early in the morning when they came to the place where their sister Elise was sleeping in the farmer's house. They hovered over the roof, turning and twisting their long necks, flapping their wings, but no one heard or saw them. They had to fly away up towards the clouds, far out into the wide world. They settled in a dark wood which stretched down to the shore. In the farmer's house, little Elise, having no other toys, played with a small green leaf. She looked through a little hole in it, and it seemed to her that she could see her brothers. Clear eyes. She longed to see them again, but it was not to be. Time passed. Elise was to go home when she was 15. But when that time came, the queen saw how pretty she was. She became angry. She would have turned her into a wild swan at once, like her brothers, but she did not dare, for the king wanted to see his daughter. Still, the queen had a plan. She took 3 toads and said to the first one, sit upon Elise's head when she comes to the bath, so that she may be as dull and slow as you. To the second toad, she said, sit upon her forehead, so that she may be as ugly as you, and then her father won't know her. And to the third toad, she said, rest upon her heart, that she may have a burden of cares. Then she placed the toads in the water of the bath, and a color green came over it. She called Elise and bade her to go into the bath. And when Elise did so, one of the toads got into her hair, another sat on her forehead, and the third on her heart. But when she stood up, 3 scarlet poppies floated on the water. The creatures had become flowers from merely having rested a moment on Elise's head and heart. She was far too good and innocent for sorcery to have any power over her. When the wicked queen saw this, she rubbed Elise with walnut juice, smeared her face with an evil-smelling salve and matted her beautiful hair. It would have been impossible for anyone to recognize Elise. Even when her father saw her, he said she could not be his daughter. Elise wept and thought of her 11 brothers who were gone. She left the palace and wandered about all day, over the meadows and marshes and into a big forest. She did not know where she wanted to go, but she felt very sad. Elise made up her mind. She'd look for her brothers, but she had only been in the wood for a short time when night fell, and she lay down upon the soft moss and said her prayer. She rested her head against a tree stump. It was very still. The air was mild, and hundreds of glowworms shone around her like green fire. When she awoke in the morning, she went to a pond to wash. There, reflected in the water, she saw her discolored face. She wet her hand, rubbed her skin well, and looked like the beautiful royal child that she was. Walking farther into the forest, she met an old woman with a basket full of berries, who shared them with her. As she ate, Elise asked the woman if she had ever seen the 11 princes who were her brothers. I want to stop for a minute. In fairy tales, often there's our kings and queens and princesses or princes, check. There are often evil stepmothers, check. There are often things that come in threes, like the frog, check. And there are often old women who ask questions or who you ask questions of, check. No, replied the old woman, but yesterday I saw 11 swans with golden crowns upon their heads swimming in the stream. She led Elise to a slope at the foot, which flowed through the stream. Elise thanked her and walked along by the river till it flowed out to sea, but not a sail was to be seen on the sea, nor a single boat. She looked at the pebbles on the beach. How was she to get any farther? All the pebbles were worn round by the water. Glass, iron, stone, whatever was washed up had been shaped by the water, which yet was much softer than her hand. She determined that there would be as untiring as the sea in seeking her brothers. When the sun was just about to set, Elise saw 11 wild swans with golden crowns upon their heads, flying along the shore. They flew one behind the other, and by the way, there is Elise and the old lady. And the swans flew one behind the other like a white ribbon streamer. Elise climbed up on the bank and hid behind a bush. The swans settled close by and flapped their great white wings. As the sun set, the swans shed their feathers and became 11 handsome princes. A magic spell that has transformed them from princes to animal. They were Elise's brothers, and although she had changed, she knew them at once. She sprang into their arms, calling them by name. They were delighted that they recognized their little sister, who had grown up so big and beautiful. They laughed and cried and told each other how wickedly their stepmother had treated them. We brothers fly about as swans when the sun is in the sky, said the eldest. But when it goes down, we regain our human shapes. We always have to look for a resting place. But we always have to look for a resting place near sunset, or we happen to be flying among the clouds, we would drop to the earth below. We do not live here. There is another land beyond the sea, but we must cross the ocean to reach it. There is only one lonely rock midway across that is just big enough for us to stand upon close together in our human form. Our flight takes 2 of the longest days in the year. Our 2 days longer, we may stay here, and then we must fly away again across the ocean. How can I save you? Asked their sister. They talked about it for nearly the whole night, only dozing for a few hours. Elise was awakened by the rustling of the swans' wings as they soared above. Her brothers were again changed to swans. They flew in wide circles till they were far away. One of them, the youngest, stayed behind. He laid his head in her lap, and she stroked it lovingly. They remained together all day. Toward the evening, the others came back. As the sun went down, they stood there in their natural forms. Tomorrow we must fly away, said the brothers, and we cannot come back for a whole year, but we can't leave you like this. Have you courage to go with us? Surely our strength ought to be enough to carry you across the ocean. Yes, please take me with you, said Elise. They spent the whole night in weaving a net from the elastic bark of the willow, bound together with rushes. It was large and strong. Elise lay upon it, and when the sun rose, the brothers became swans again. They took up their net in their bills and flew up to the clouds with their sister, who was still asleep. The sunbeams fell on her face, so one of the swans flew over her head to provide her some shade. They were far from land when Elise woke up. She thought she still must be dreaming. It seemed so strange to be carried through the air. By her side laid a branch of ripe berries, which the youngest brother had gathered for her. She smiled her thanks to him. She knew it was he who flew above her head, shading her from the sun. Onward the whole day they flew through the air, but went slower than usual, for now they had their sister with them to carry. A storm came up and night was drawing on. Elise saw the sun sinking and the rock was not yet in sight. The swan seemed to be taking stronger strokes than ever. And alas, she was the cause of their not being able to get on faster. As soon as the sun went down, they would become men and fall into the sea. The sun now touched the edge of the ocean. Elise's heart trembled when suddenly the swans darted downward so swiftly she thought they were falling. Then they hovered again, and half the sun was already below the water when she saw the little rock below, which seemed no bigger than the head of a seal. The sun sank very quickly. It was no bigger than a star when her foot touched firm ground. Her brothers stood around her, their arms linked together. There was just enough room for them. Waves crashed against the rock and covered them with spray. The sky shone like fire and the thunder roared. But the sister and brothers held each other's hands and sang a song which gave them hope and courage. The air was pure and still at dawn. And when the sun rose, the swans flew off with Elise. Soon she saw before her, half floating in the air, great mountains with shining ice on the summits. In the center was a palace a mile long, with row upon row of columns. Around it, palm trees waved and flowers bloomed as large as millweeds. She asked if this was the land they were going to, and the swans shook their heads. For what she saw was the beautiful, ever-changing palace of Fata Morgana, which no human dared enter. Elise gazed at it, but as she gazed at the palace, gardens, and mountains, they changed into many other things, until at last she saw the real land for which they were bound. There were rose beautiful blue mountains with cedar woods and palaces. Long before the sun went down, she sat among the hills in front of a big cave covered with delicate vines. Now we shall see what you will dream here tonight, said the youngest as he showed her where to sleep. If only I might dream how to save you. She prayed earnestly to God for help, and even if her sleep, she kept on praying. It seemed that she was flying in the palace of Fata Morgana, and the fairy came toward her radiant and beautiful, yet very much like the old woman who gave her the berries in the wood and told her of the swans with the golden crowns. Your brothers can be saved, she said, but have you courage and endurance enough for it? The sea is indeed softer than your hands, and it reshapes the hardest stones, but it does not feel the pain that your fingers feel. It has no heart and does not suffer the pain that you must feel. Okay, she's going to be tested. All fairy tales have a good test, a test of strength and courage and endurance. Do you see the stinging nettle I hold in my hand? And a stinging nettle is a plant. You don't want to touch it because it has things in it that something in it that irritates your skin. It makes you all itchy, and it's not a pleasant sensation. Many of these nettles grow round the cave where you sleep. Only these and the ones which grow in the churchyards may be used. These you must pluck, though they will burn and blister your hands. Crush the nettles with your feet. You will have flax, and of that you must weave 11 coats with long sleeves. Throw these over the wild swans, and the spell will be broken. But remember, from the moment you begin work until it is finished, you must not speak even a word. The first word you say will pierce the hearts of your brothers. Their lives hang on your tongues. When Elise woke, it was bright daylight. She fell upon her knees in thanks to God and left the cave to begin her work. She grasped the stinging nettles with her delicate hands. Great blisters rose on her hands and arms, but she suffered it willingly. And then she crushed every nettle with her bare feet and twisted it into green flax. And flax can be like a thread or a yarn that she could weave into the coats. So there she is. She's weaving the coats for her brothers. The sun went down and the brothers came back. They were alarmed at finding her speechless. They thought it was some new sorcery of the Ricketts stepmothers. But when they saw her hands, they understood that it was for their sakes. The youngest brother wept, and where his tears fell, she felt no more pain, and the blisters disappeared. She spent the whole night at work until she could not rest, till she had saved her dear brothers. All the following day, her brothers were away. She sat alone, but never had time flown so quickly. One coat was already finished, and she had begun the second, when she heard a huntsman's horn, and it struck her with fear. The sound came nearer, and she heard dogs barking. She rushed into the cave and tied the nettles she had gathered into a bundle and sat upon them. At this moment, a big dog bounded forward from the thicket, and another and another. They barked loudly, and in a few minutes some huntsmen were standing outside the cave, and the most handsome of all was the king of the country. There's the king. There's the handsome king to save her, maybe. He stepped up to Elise, and never had he seen such a lovely girl. "How did you come here, beautiful child?" he asked. But Elise shook her head. She dared not speak. The lives of her brothers depended upon her silence. She hid her hands under her apron so the king might not see what she had suffered. "Come with me," he said. "You cannot stay here. If you are good as you are beautiful, I will dress you in silk and velvet and place a golden crown upon your head, and you shall live in my richest palace." Then he lifted her upon her horse. She began to cry. "I think only of your happiness," the king said. "One day you will thank me for this." Then he galloped away, holding her before him on his horse, and the huntsman followed. When the sun went down, the royal city lay before them, and the king led her into the palace where the great fountains played in the marble halls, and where walls and ceilings were covered with rich paintings. But she had no eyes for them. She only wept and sorrowed. She allowed the women to dress her in royal robes, to twist pearls in her hair, and to draw gloves over her blistered hands. As she stood before them, all in her lovely splendor, she was so lovely that the court bowed low before her. And although the archbishop shook his head and whispered that he feared the young maiden was a witch who had dazzled their eyes and led astray the heart of their king, the king refused to listen. He ordered music to be played and the richest food to be brought forward. Elise was led through the fragrant gardens and gorgeous halls, but nothing brought her smile to her lips or into her eyes. Sorrow sat there for all time. The king opened the door of a little room, and on the floor were the costly green carpets made to resemble exactly the cave where he had found her. And the bundle of flax she had spun from nettles was there too, and on the ceiling hung the coat she had made. One of the huntsmen had brought back all these things from the cave as curiosities. Here you may dream that you are back in your former home. It may amuse you to think of such things. When Elise saw the things so dear to her heart, she smiled at last and kissed the king's hand joyfully. He pressed her to his heart and ordered the church bells to ring out the news that the silent, lovely girl from the woods was to be queen of the country. She's going to marry the king. The archbishop, still suspecting the girl to be a witch of some kind, whispered his wicked thoughts to the king, but the king would not find it in his heart to believe him. The wedding was still to take place, and the archbishop himself had to place the crown upon her head. In his anger, he pressed the narrow circlet so tightly upon her head that it caused pain. But a heavy weight pressed upon her heart, sorrow for her brothers, so she did not cry out. Every day, Elise's heart turned more and more to good and handsome king who did everything to please her. She longed to confide in him and tell him of her grief, but silent she had to remain. Therefore, each night she went quietly into the little room to weave one coat after another. When she came to the seventh, however, she had no flax left. She knew that the nettles she used would grow in the churchyard, and she had to pluck them herself. With a trembling heart, as if she were doing some wicked deed, she crept out one night into the silent garden and passed through the silent streets to the churchyard. There she picked the stinging nettles and hurried back to the palace with them. Only one person saw her, and that was the archbishop. Now he felt sure that all was not as it should be, that she was a witch. He was sure of that, and that she had bewitched the king and all the people. Do you think it's going to end happy for Elise? Do you think the archbishop is going to have her declared a witch? We'll see. We've got, a few more pages to read. When the king heard the archbishop had seen, he was much distressed. He pretended to sleep that night, but no sleep came to his eyes, for he too saw how Elise got into her private room, and the next night and the next were much the same. And then again, Elise had no more flax left, not a single nettle. She had, however, almost reached the end of her work. Only one more coat was yet to be finished. Once more she went for a lonely walk to the churchyard to pluck a few handfuls of stinging nettles, but this time the king and the archbishop followed her. The king must judge her. The people must judge her, groaned the king sorrowfully. When the people heard of her mysterious movements, they judged. She is a witch. She must die by fire. So again, they don't understand. She can't explain, so they condemn. Elise was led away from her beautiful royal apartment to a dark, damp dungeon where the wind whistled through the bars. Instead of velvet and silk, they gave her coats which she had woven to cover herself, and the bundle of nettles for a pillow. But nothing could have pleased her more. She set to work again with a prayer. Toward evening, she heard a flutter of swan's wings. It was her youngest brother. He had found his sister, and he sobbed with joy, although he knew that the coming night might be her last. But then her work was almost done. Her brothers were near. Then the archbishop arrived to be with her during her last hours, as he had promised the king. But she shook her head and begged him by looks and gestures not to stay, for she had only this night in which to finish her work. The little mice ran about the floor, bringing nettles to her feet, so as to give what help they could, and a thrush sat outside the window, singing all night to keep up courage. It was still an hour before sunrise when the 11 brothers stood at the palace gate, demanding to be brought before the king. This could not be, was the answer, for it was still too early for the king to be awakened. All their pleas were useless. Then the king himself came to see what the noise meant, but just then the sun rose, and no brothers were to be seen, only 11 wild swans flying over the palace. Now the people came streaming forth from the gates of the city to see the witch burn. An old horse cart drew in which Elise sat. They had dressed her in coarse sackcloth, and her long, beautiful hair hung loose. Her cheeks were pale and her lips moved silently, while her fingers still worked at the green flax. Even on her way to her death, she would not give up her task. 10 coats lay completed at her feet. She was working hard on the 11th, while the people jeered her and said, "See the witch, how she mutters. She sits there with her ugly sorcery. Take it away from her and tear it into 1,000 bits." The crowd pressed around her, but just then 11 wild swans flew down perched upon the cart, flapping their wings. Elise hastily threw the 11 coats over the swans, who were immediately changed to 11 handsome princes. But the youngest had a swan's wing, because she had not been able to finish the last sleeve of the coat. "Now I might speak," she exclaimed. "I am innocent." The people who saw what had happened bowed before her as before a saint, and she fainted into her brother's arms. And the fear and the suffering she endured. "Yes, she is innocent," said the eldest brother, and he told all that had happened. When Elise awoke from her swoon, her heart was filled with joy and peace. All the church bells began to ring of their own accord. The birds sang sweetly, and a wedding procession went back to the palace with such as no king had ever seen. And guess what? That's the end. Do you think that Elise lived happily ever after with her king? Do you think the 11 princes got to go home and maybe bring justice to their kingdom? Well, no, because that's where the story ends. Guys, there are lots of great fairy tales that you can read in NC Wise Owl. I'm going to go show you real quick. NC Wise Owl. Oops, I'm going to go back to the main screen. You're going to click on ncwiseowl.org. You're going to go to the elementary zone. I hope you can see that. Can you see that? Let me try again. There you go. You're going to go to the elementary zone and down here to the ebooks collection. Now, when it says sign in with Google, do not sign in with Google. You just go down here where it says enter NCWise password, and the password is WiseOwl19. And you're going to click sign in. Now you're in the ebooks for NC Wise Owl. And if you want a fairy tale, you can type fairy tale and search. Remember, there's over 11,000 ebooks. Many are fiction and nonfiction. Now, I was reading from Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, but Grimm fairy tales are my very favorite. The brothers Grimm were actually two brothers whose last name was Grimm. They were 17th century French scholars, and they traveled across the country writing down all the stories that were told in the small villages and taverns and towns, the things that were never written down before. They'd only been told and passed down, these folk tales from generation to generation, and they wrote them into these collections. So Grimm's fairy tale is one of my favorites. To open a book, you would click on the title and scroll down, and right here where it says you can look at this on the screen. You can download it onto your device. So I'm going to click on it because I don't want to download it to my computer. But if you have a tablet, you could download it to read. And it's going to open. Oops, I clicked. Sorry. Here's the Brothers Grimm. Now, you can't really see, and let me move the little window. You can't really see the whole book. So here's what I do. Down here in the corner, there's the little arrows going out, and I click on that first, and there you go. And now you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard or on the screen, and there's an introduction. So Grimm's fairy tales, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. They were born in Hanau in the Principality of Hesse, and they went when they were 11 and 9 in 1796. Their father died, and they lost everything. And their boy's aunt paid for them to go to, I said French. I meant German, not French, not me. And they were very brilliant. And so they went around collecting stories. Jacob was a librarian. How about that? Just like me. It wasn't a lot of money, but they collected them and wrote stories. And you can read the stories. If it doesn't quite fit, you can use the plus and minus to make it smaller. There we go. Oh, this is just the book plate. I thought it was the page. Frogkin or Iron Henry. I made it too small, so I'm going to make it bigger. And then you can scroll through and read the story. I'm going to hit the escape button on my screen, and I'm going to go back to, see up here where it says back. It's going to take me back to my search window, back to the record for Brothers Grimm. And then see right here where it says result list. I'm going to click on that. It's going to take me back to the list. So there's another book called Classic Fairy Tales, Russian fairy tales right here. And here's some more Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales if you want to read more. So there are many different books in here. Celtic fairy tales, which would be fairy tales found in Ireland, Scotland, Wales. Lots of different fairy tales in here. English fairy tales. Oscar Wilde, you might have heard of the Fairy Tale Prince. So there's pages and pages of fairy tales you can read in NC Wise Owl. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this story. Come back next week, 11 o'clock on Fridays. I think we're going to do, let me get out of this screen. I found my Scary Stories 3. More Tales to Chill Your Bones by Alvin Schwartz. When you were younger in first and second grade, you may have read In a Dark, Dark Room, that collection of fairy tales by Alvin Schwartz. But these are folk tales that are scary tales. He wrote, I think he wrote more than three, but I have the three stories, scary stories to tell in the dark. We have the first, I think we have all of these in with a different cover on them in the library as well as in a dark, dark room. So next week, we'll talk about what books you're reading, and I'll read you a couple stories from Scary Stories, More Tales, and Bone to Chill Your Bones. Bye, guys.